Hello, this is Dan Curry with the Deeds of God website, and this is part of the 6-day series discussing how the human body and human anatomy seems to have images built onto it and into it by God, and that its design seems to preclude any idea but, in my opinion, any idea but that God was our creator, Jesus beside him, that Jesus is built into our body in picture form, and that our body is fearfully and wonderfully made, that it is a holy temple of sorts, and that it is made in the images of God, or in the image of God. Today I want to talk about the cell, and I want to discuss how the cell simply could not have come about by itself. To begin with, I would like to say that, when scientists first looked under a microscope that was able to see a cell, they saw something like a circle or an oval. And it was pretty exciting for them to see it for the first time, to realize, that's probably the fundamental building block of every creature. It kind of looked like an amorphous blob, just some kind of oval or circle. But, it seemed like probably that was the smallest unit, smallest whole functional unit. Well, they ended up being right, but even though such findings as that started to embolden scientists to say that religion was kind of a scam or kind of a placebo for the masses, or some comforting but unintelligent way to explain away the surroundings that we live in, they began to be emboldened by things like this, discoveries of this sort. But as time went by and their equipment improved and their knowledge level of what they were looking at improved, and they did more and more experimentation and were able to fill in the picture, it no longer was so much an amorphous blob as a little machine. It's made out of organic materials. It's not made out of steel and copper and chrome and tungsten or anything. It's a biological machine, though. It's like a living organism. A human being, we walk around with a chest and abdomen full of organs, and of course our skull has our brain, to whatever extent we bear it, and we need those organs. Like, it's sad to be born without a pair of lungs, right? We don't want to be born without a heart, right? Livers, very useful. We want a liver. Well, this is a cell, and these are pictures of organelles that are in just about every cell. A bacteria may not have a nucleus, but just about everything else does, and that's just the nucleus I'm speaking of. There's all these other little organelles, and they vary slightly based on the type of cell it is, but there's always, a good cast of characters here that's approaching a dozen at least, and each one of them has its own little job, but each one of them relies on the other ones being there to do its job. And there's a coding, a language that explains how to build these things. It's our chromosomes, it's our genes, it's our DNA, it's our information sequences. To build a house, you got to have a house plan, right? Well, if you want to think of it this way, this is more or less like a brick in a brick house. You can't have a brick house without functional bricks. You can't have an organism, a multicellular organism, without functional cells. So here's the question that honestly has to be answered with a yes in order for evolution to be a true and functional process. The question is, can you build even one cell by accident just to get the ball rolling in the very beginning? So let's go back in pretend time to some long ago time when there was no cell, and let's say lightning struck a mud puddle that was full of just the right materials, some kind of energy, some kind of materials available. Poof, the first cell sprang into being. Well, what is it that would have needed to spring into being? You can't just have a circular blob anymore, right? Because we now know that a cell, even the simplest ones, are full of organelles. They call these organelles. They're like organs inside of a human. So what would have had to come into being? Well, you have a membrane. They call it a plasma membrane. This is cytoplasm. It's sort of a jelly, and embedded within the jelly, and remember there's a sphere, not a circle, but there's different organelles. These are little machines that perform functions that have to do with what we would call metabolism, I suppose, most closely. And they don't do the same job as each other. They each have their own peculiar job. So This membrane is composed of lipids and proteins, not just one material, but a mixed, but very specifically mixed material. It's got to be able to identify things. It's got to be able to identify chemicals on the outside that it wants more of on the inside, and it needs to be able to take chemicals on the inside and pass them out. You know, like garbage, taking out the garbage, getting rid of poisons and toxins. It has little holes passing through it. They have to be the right size. They have to be able to sense what it is that's at the opening, decide what to do with it, and manage to do it successfully. And when it lets something bad out, it can't also let good stuff out. It's got to be able to regulate it. This is a machine, a very specifically constructed machine. I mean, the holes have to be a certain size, the material has to be a certain type, the proteins, well, there's got to be a lot of different proteins, and they have to know what they're doing. They have to be coded to function in a certain way. The lysosomes, the peroxisomes, the Golgi apparatus, the centrioles, the ribosomes, the mitochondria, and the nucleus, they all have very specific jobs. If this was the underneath of your car, you might be looking at a transmission, an engine, a battery, an alternator, a starter. And you know, when you look down and see an alternator, you see a belt is attached to it, and there's sort of a metal encasement of something, right? Well, guess what? We all know there's something inside that. You know, there's copper wires, there's poles, there's bearings. So, you know, there are parts inside of each of these subparts of each of these that are absolutely necessary for the proper function of this organelle. Now, are we going to go back and say that any process, any accidental process whatsoever, could ever, and remember, you need most of these, you need almost all of these. So, you know, if you damage any one of these, like in its entirety, there might be a bunch of peroxisomes or a bunch of lysosomes, but if you were to destroy them all the lysosomes, or all the peroxisomes, this thing is a crippled cell. It may even be a dead cell. It may not be able to reproduce itself. Well, this skin has to be super functional and super specific in the job that it does, very discerning in the job it does. The nucleus contains all this information, our chromosomes, our genes, our DNA. There's actually miles of it from what I understand. There's you know, thousands and thousands of specific genes in a human. Thousands. And that's a language. Remember, this is a language. You know, it contains information, but with a language, you've got to have somebody who can generate the language. That very first cell has to generate a language it can use. Well, how would it have that? How would it have the structures that are capable of performing that function? Let alone, let's say it makes a language. How does it get these guys, which have to be already up and running, to answer to that language and to return information in that language to the other parts that it needs to communicate with? I mean, there's some language, right? It's the language of, it's the DNA language, but these guys had to be conversant in this language from the first. There had to be about this many parts. They had to be on the same page. They had to be pre-built with their little parts inside of them functioning. They had to have this environment, this jelly environment, which is separate from everything else. And there's these you know, smooth and rough endoplasmic reticulums that sort of are like billowing spherical curtains, one inside the other, that sort of channel things from one place to the other, or give it a channel path. I mean, if this makes something, it's got to be able to get the part it made over to the next part that needs it. If it needs to make something, it's got to get raw materials delivered to it. You understand what I'm saying? To create even one cell, one functional cell, is mentally exhausting. You know, to come up with some plan whereby a cell invented itself almost instantaneously, because this cell couldn't function long while it was waiting for a part to be developed that wasn't there yet. I mean, these things all needed to be there from the outset, from the moment it was made. It had very little time before it needed to have every single other part up and running functionally. Well, remember, whatever it drew from the environment, it wasn't the decayed parts of other living things. This is the first cell. I guess it had to draw its raw materials from sand and water and rocks and what other chemicals the earth provided in raw and mixed form, but you know, as far as biological decay material around it that it could use for fuel, no, there was none. For building parts, There wasn't none. This is the first cell. So please understand that science knows quite a lot about cells now, and that's great. I commend them. But they absolutely made it up that this thing could have produced itself. Absolute fable. Complete and total fable. And as far as large organisms like transitional fossils, I understand from everybody that's ever written about this that there is no museum or college anywhere on Earth that has the skeleton of a transitional creature on display. They say that none have ever been found. And I mean not even one. Not even one creature. You know, since the mid-1800s when Darwin's Origin of the Species book came out, you know, they've had 150 or better years to find even one. And some things have been put forth as the missing link, but they've always been shot down during peer review process by other scientists who said, no, you've mistaken it. You know, it's a new species. We've found 10 more of them, and they all look the same, and it just sort of happens to kind of fit between that and that, but it never does veer the one way towards the one or seem to regress the other towards. In other words, it's separate and discrete. Apparently always has been. Everything they put forth as the missing link has always turned out to be not the missing link. And no place on Earth, anywhere, claims to be displaying a transitional fossil after all these years. There's tens of thousands of fossil beds. There's thousands of them on every continent. There's how many colleges, how many professors, and how many different, you know, areas of expertise that involve evolution. But none of them have been able to come up with the skeleton of an evolving creature. I mean, think of that. So you can't make even one cell. You can see you cannot. There's not even one transitional skeleton on display on this earth. Evolution simply isn't how things came to be or how they stayed in being. It just is not. I'm Dan Curry, Deeds of God website. This is the 6-day presentation. Thank you for listening.